Hi, I'm Gary Young.
And I'm Carys. Every week, Gary and I will be talking about the stories in the news that we think are overreported.
And the ones that are going completely under the radar and not talked about enough.
This is Over the Top, Under the Radar. Hey, Gary. How you doing?
Not too bad, thanks. How you been?
Yeah, good. Went to Wales. As you know, I'm half Welsh. Went to the Mumbles with my family. More on which later. And we wanted to say thank you actually to everyone who tweeted or messaged us about the ads that you heard on last week's podcast. So just to give a bit of sunlight in on magic, we're currently making the podcast for free. Some people working on it are getting paid, but lots of other people who are working on it are not. Ads is one way that people pay for the cost of podcasts. For people who got in touch and were surprised by some of the ads that they heard around our chat, we don't control the ads that get played. And so we've taken the decision to turn the ads off so that we're not talking to you about the housing crisis and then getting an advert from a property developer. So we've created a Patreon so that people who enjoy our podcast can help to support the production costs and pay the wages of the people who work on it behind the scenes and us as well.
Yeah, we're up against the BBC, the Murdochs. We're also up against Gary Lineker, very rich man. This is run by a small, independent, black-owned production company. And so we need your support if we are going to carry on doing what we're doing. 2,500 monthly donators on Patreon would mean that we could cover our production costs, which we're not doing at the moment. 3,500 donators on Patreon means everyone working on a podcast, including volunteers, gets paid. So put your money where your ears are and back Over the Top and Under the Radar.
I think before we jump into it, we do need to talk about the European elections. So for those not paying attention, which is probably not many people, the European parliamentary elections took place, which is the EU parliament that we're no longer a part of. So first time since 2019 that we haven't gone to the polls. How are you feeling about the results?
Well, they were long trailed in a sense, like last week when I was talking about Nigel Farage, and I'd like to thank you all for the hate mail that came because I dared to speak about Nigel Farage in less than glowing terms, that fascism was once again a mainstream ideology in Europe. And, here we are with the far right doing very well in France, in Hungary, in
Germany. I think that was the scariest, the AfD doing so well.
Spain, they did well. This is where we are. It's incredibly troubling.
Yeah, I mean, it was AfD, which is Germany's fascist party, second biggest party in the vote. SPD came third. Pretty terrifying, given Germany had actual fascism within living memory.
And I have a personal memory from 1984 when I went to France. I'd done a school exchange in Saint-Astier in the Dordogne. I'd got on well with another kid as well as my partner. So I went out in the summer because I was doing A-level French. So I went out in the summer to stay with this other kid, and I'd been in his house for about 2 days. And this was in 1984, and it was just after Jean-Marie Le Pen got, I think it was 8% in France, and it was a shock. And the guy came in with a tent, and he was crying, and he said, we have a problem. And his dad was such a racist that he said, I cannot have this boy in my house. And I bet he's spoken to his dad and done anything.
How old were you?
15. There was a campsite just over the weir, and we went to the campsite, and he was crying, and he helped me set up the tent. Yeah, that was 1984. God. They got 8%. This time they got over 30%. And, my experiences of being in France, I studied in Paris for 5 months.
I was going to say, you speak French, right? You did a degree in French and Russian, for those of you who don't know.
Yeah. And so I was in Paris for 5 months. It was the most intense racist experience I've ever had in my life. And I was beaten up by the cops in the subway. I was stopped and searched at least twice a week, but often much more. This has been a long time coming. I think. And that one of the things that we should be, we'll talk about it now, but we should probably talk about it at some stage, is that in most of these countries, including France and Italy and Portugal and Spain, they all had big communist parties. They all did. During that election, the Communist Party got 10% or something, or 12% in France. And you have to ask yourself what kind of political education the left was doing to allow this, for those communist parties to collapse and for the primary opposition to mainstream politics being now the far right. That there was a failure of the left in this, I think.
I was talking to a friend about it because obviously it's a scary, weird thing. And she was like, well, are we ahead of them or are we behind them? Like, was the Brexit vote our version of this? I think it's not a race that we're all in. I think and honestly, it's kind of scary and then interesting, but also scary. Like, I think it ping pongs across the Atlantic around Europe. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Nigel Farage stumping for Donald Trump. The solidarity of all these far-right groups feels a bit odd, given they're sort of defined by just being like, our country's the best, fuck you. But I think that way that they're in a conversation with one another, they're stealing each other's playbook. So this like delegitimizing elections. They've probably all got, I mean, someone write in if you know, but they're probably all working with like the same 5 lobbying firms, right? It's, increasingly a bit of like an international conversation. And I think the thing I'm conscious of is that we don't talk a lot or enough about what's going on in other countries and in Europe. I watched a debate about, Macron's decision to call the election, but 2 women on Channel 4 News, and one of them said, well, you have to look at the immigration bill that he just passed to understand why he did this now. And I was like, ooh, what's the immigration bill? So I think I'm feeling a bit like one of the things I can do is inform myself a bit more so that this stuff doesn't feel like so much of a surprise or just upsetting,
Do you want to start with your over?
I want to start with my over. I want to talk to you about my over the top, Gary. I feel strongly about this. I'm over party manifestos. I'm absolutely over them. I actually think we should abolish them.
Why's that?
A few reasons. So basically in the last 7 days, 4 of the biggest political parties in the country have dropped their manifestos. This is just a bunch of long, boring documents filled with promises that won't be kept, that no one actually cares about or pays attention to. I'm not saying manifestos never had meaning. I think the 1945 manifestos, which, led to the first Labour government, were meaningful and important. I'm sure that back in the 1800s, when the only way that we had contact with people was through written manifestos that were circulated by leaflet or in the newspapers, Now there are these 100-page documents filled with policies, most of which no one will ever read or learn about. And then, most likely, most of them won't be implemented. What do you think?
Here's where I agree, and I'm going to do this by way of comparison. In America, when I was reporting from America, which I did for 12 years for The Guardian, I used to argue, and this is why no one would ever let me run anything, that we shouldn't actually go to the conventions, that the Republican and the Democratic conventions, they are set up for the media. That is an excellent reason for the media not to go. Even the atmosphere is kind of staged. And it is true that you do meet a certain kind of person. My feeling was that we should just send the theatre critic because it's just theatre. That's all it is. And I feel like the manifestos are not really for the voters. They're for the parties. To that extent, I agree with you. But something more recent than 1945, which is a 2017 Labour manifesto, which was a bit of a game changer. I can't remember the specifics, apart from communist broadband, but I do think that what the manifesto spelt out in terms of its tax policies and so on was, let's stop talking about Jeremy Corbyn and whether he supported the IRA. Let's actually talk about something concrete. And because of broadcasting rules, people had to report them once the election started. And I think it did change the conversation. The other thing is, are you then saying that the parties shouldn't promise anything because they're not going to keep their promise? And if they are going to promise things, how are they going to deliver that promise?
Yeah, so I take your point that sometimes a manifesto can be important, but I think increasingly that is the exception rather than the rule. Like probably the most memorable manifesto pledge from recent years was the Lib Dem pledge on tuition fees, which they didn't uphold. And the 2017 Labour manifesto, like maybe you're right, but wasn't that more broadly about Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party getting an amount of airtime because of election rules that it hadn't before, and also a group of people, a group of voters who supported Jeremy Corbyn, young people being one example, had that he was on the ballot for the first time and they had the chance to turn out, and they turned out in big numbers and they were underestimated. I don't know that the manifesto was a requirement of that. I think people vote based on values and emotions. I don't think there are many people who are going to be totting up line by line everything in these documents and being like, oh, well, Labour said capital gains tax should, but then the Tories, like, it's kind of vibes and values. And so I think politicians should make promises. I actually think we should have better accountability mechanisms to be like, did you keep your promises? I don't want to read another long and boring document.
I do like vibes and values as a kind of...
That's how you're all going to vote. Don't pretend otherwise.
I'm not sure that, while that, I think that is probably true, I'm not sure that I want to submit to that, because the vibes and values thing, then Boris Johnson won on vibes. I mean, among other things, but you do get into this place of like, who would you rather have a drink with?
I think he also won on symbolic policies. I think he also won on get Brexit done. I'm interested in things that give you a sense of this is what we believe and that's what it would mean in action. But the thing I really react against, and I think journalists are as complicit as politicians in this like hollowing out of policy agendas and manifestos, is you get this big headline commitment. So like 3,000 new nurseries was the Labour one that Bridget Phillipson announced in the last week. And then you find out, okay, well, what does new mean? Oh, well, it means a new nursery, or if like an existing nursery or primary school like adds a class. So then they do this weird like math thing where they're like the 3,000 isn't 3,000. And then they're like, oh, well, that's in the small print. And then you have an exchange between the shadow education secretary and I think it was a Channel 4 news journalist, where then you're quibbling on like how to define new and whether or not it's true. This like weird creative accounting thing is just, it's bad vibes, Gary.
And this week, I think actually it was published the day before we were recording, trust in British politics has reached an all-time low. That was the British survey of attitudes.
Oh, I love the BSA.
And that moves back to this issue of the, you know, the far right and Europe and so on, that when people stop trusting, they get desperate and they get disaffected. Like, this change is not going to happen for me.
This year of all years, the manifestos feel particularly redundant because you've got a Conservative Party who have been in power for 14 years. So like the idea there's all this stuff they want to do. It's like, oh, our exciting manifesto. And then we've got a Labour Party whose pretty explicit strategy is just like say as little as possible, be as boring as possible. We're just not the Tories. I'm not into it. Do a TikTok dance and like yell out 5 vibes and 5 values that you're going to bring. And I'm more into that, Gary. I'm over it.
You're a vibes and values voter.
I'm a vibes and values voter.
My trouble with vibes and values is that sometimes they're not rooted in reality. People think there are 4 times as many Muslims or twice as many refugees and asylum seekers or immigrants or whatever. That's the vibe. A lot of the vibes, they're bad vibes.
Oh yeah,
they're bad vibes.
No, I think you're right. And I don't want to, if we lose all fact or the idea that there are like objective truths in politics, like the cost of nursery, the number of people coming into the country, the likelihood of people being able to buy a home or rent at an affordable rate. Like there are things that are true. And if we on the left sit around opining that no one believes in facts anymore, or worse still, just yell facts at people that don't agree with us, we're not going to get very far. I think we should still have promises and policies.
Yeah, I would like to hear if you're a vibes or a values voter, or both.
Or both, yeah.
Vibes and values.
Maybe that could be, we could do a t-shirt. Vibes voter.
T-shirt.
Values voter.
On the front, it says Vibes and Values. And on the back, it says South London Fundamentalist. Or Vibes and Values on the front, Fuckboy on the back.
Fuckboys definitely run on vibes. They have no values, Gary.
My over for this week is D-Day struck the war. What I think was clearly a mistake for Rishi Sunak to leave early is obviously that's like bad manners. It's crass. The idea that this was the kind of worst thing ever. Oh my God, he's done it now. Oh, and I think it's and journalism does this often. They confect these outrages, which what happens is they say, did you see he left early? Isn't that outrageous? Then that becomes a question. How outrageous is it that he left early?
Yeah, I do think it's shit stirring from journalists, but I think I'm on the fence because sometimes you do something and it's indicative of a bigger problem.
So what would be the problem here?
So I disagree with Farage that Rishi doesn't understand our culture. Coming through with a low blow. I mean, he just kind of goes below my expectations every time. So I think for some people, yeah, it does activate a little racist synapse of like the brown man didn't stay. I don't think that, but I do think it is like he's not got an incredibly well-run campaign or an incredibly sharp team.
Well, yeah, I mean, it clearly illustrates his tin ear, right? So, which, bearing in mind that he came in he lost to Liz Truss and he only came in after like she had tanked everything. It's like, let's get the brown people in to clear up the mess. And we are this is the 80th year of the kind of D-Day landings, liberation of Paris, all of that kind of stuff. And this is where a lot of my academic work is centered at the moment. At that celebration, and people kind of use this when they talked about Rishi Sunak. Those people fought for our freedom. They sacrificed their lives so that we could be free and so on. There is a really basic problem with that narrative. People did sacrifice their lives. That is very important that they did. And they were fighting one of the most pathological, nihilistic ideologies in terms of Nazism and fascism. But whatever else it was not a fight for freedom. Britain had colonies around the world where people couldn't vote. Soviet Union had its own issues with democracy, as we know. America was fighting with a segregated army and was defending a system of segregation. You actually had, when the Germans were in Nuremberg, on the one hand, them teaching a denazification to the Germans and preaching denazification and making Germans go to cinemas to watch stories about the horrors of the camps and so on. And on the other hand, they were teaching the Germans how to enforce a color bar so that African Americans and white Americans couldn't mix and African Americans wouldn't mix too much with white German women. That whatever that war was, it was not a fight for freedom. And it was an important thing to do. We have to stop referring to it in a way that counts out most of humanity, actually.
Yeah, that's a complicated conversation. And our political discourse, media, class aren't super interested in complicated conversations. They want to point at a picture and say, why weren't you there? I think the thing I find weird is the like mystification and untouchability of this war, where increasingly most people alive in the UK didn't live through it or experience it or remember it. And we're not allowed to talk about it in a real way.
Or the multiracial element of the war, that approximately 1 million people from Africa and around 20,000 people from the Caribbean, including the French Caribbean, fought in that war.
Yeah, I've got Ghanaian ancestors fought in wars. I don't know if any of my Welsh ancestors did, but I know members of my Ghanaian family fought in the First and Second World War.
Right, and your Ghanaian family fought for rights that they themselves couldn't enjoy. When we talk about Western values, European values, liberal Western values and stuff like that, the biggest threat in the last century to those values came from within Europe, not outside it. The dominant experience of anti-Semitism was in Europe, not from Muslims, but from Europeans. The most deadly and vicious expression of anti-Semitism came from within Europe. A significant number of Black people, Asian people from India and elsewhere came to Europe or fought elsewhere to defend Europe from itself. And so when we talk about they're coming over here and they don't understand that. But when he says they don't understand British, he doesn't understand British values. When they talk about Black people and foreigners in this way, this kind of the great unwashed coming to us, it's like, look, in your hour of need, large numbers of these people laid down their lives against your pathologies, not theirs, not that other parts of the world don't have their own, but yours. And here's a quote from Churchill at Yalta, the Yalta conference, which was kind of near Crimea. He's with Roosevelt and Stalin, and they're talking about the post-Cold War world and the judiciary and so on. And Churchill says, I will have no suggestion that the British Empire is put in the dock and examined by everybody to see if it is up to their standard. Never, never, never. Every scrap of territory over which the British flag flies is immune. And that exempts Britain from the watchful eye of the international judiciary as it is massacring people in Kenya and Malaya and elsewhere, and as it's depriving people of democracy through the 40s and the 50s, well into the 60s.
Yeah, and for those people who slid into our DMs with, racist comments and thoughts after we dared to speak about Farage, read a book. Why do you think we're here?
So what's your under for this week?
So my under the radar is a column by a Welsh woman called Rhiannon Picton-James, who lives in the Mumbles, which is where I was over the weekend visiting my Auntie Sue. Hi, Auntie Sue. She listens, Gary.
Auntie Sue.
So the Mumbles is in South Wales. It's sidebar. It's got a funny place name. We think maybe it's because the silhouette of the landscape looks like breasts. So there's a theory that it's from the French, which you all know, la mamelle.
Could have been so much worse, couldn't it? It could have just been called the tits.
Yeah, it was a good they went for the French. Anyway, it's on the south coast of Wales. It's absolutely beautiful, as well as being a place that I have a family connection to. It's where Catherine Zeta-Jones is from. Rhiannon wrote, come on, she's a big Welsh export. Don't laugh at Catherine Zeta-Jones. You should be so lucky to know her. Lovely woman, I'm sure. So it's, Rhiannon was writing about the gentrification of Mumbles, essentially, right, which I had anecdotally noticed because it'd been a couple of years since I'd been, and they've got an M&S food hall, Gary, which, as we all know, is the sign of that is peak gentrification.
You've arrived.
For those of you who don't know, I was born in Brixton, an area of London that has gentrified. So my gentrification antenna were on. But it wasn't until I read this lovely column from Rhiannon, which we can link to in the newsletter, that I fully understood the extent of it. And the thing that she's particularly concerned about is this COVID migration of people from England, but specifically London. So the Centre for Cities found that in a 2-year period, 2020 and 2021, there was nearly a 30% increase in Londoners moving to other parts of England and Wales, so countryside, coastal towns, for the lifestyle. And then now what we've got is a situation where people who are earning London wages, so high wages, and have the privilege of being able to work remotely or not have to go into an office in London every day, have now pushed house prices up in the Mumbles to the point where Rhiannon, whose family have been in Mumbles for 5 generations, her grandparents ran a hotel, she's got a young daughter, are priced out. The Welsh government actually does have a pretty strong policy on English people having holiday homes or second homes in Wales. They get taxed pretty aggressively, but there isn't really a way to deal with people who have remote jobs, which many of us do now, just kind of all picking up and moving somewhere. And so it's an under the radar for me, partly because so many Welsh stories go under the radar, Gary. And, it's my job as a Welsh Ghanaian to bring them to our podcast, but also because I think there's something, we do talk about housing, and I think we're not talking about enough in the election, but there is a sense there's a housing crisis. But I think the thing that this is about, it is about housing, but it's also about class and privilege, and a group of people who increasingly have the privilege to live and work anywhere. You know, you just need an Airbnb account and your laptop and an internet connection, and you can live wherever you want. And then a group of people who are being priced out of their homes. In the case of, you know, some working class Londoners told by a local authority, you've got to leave London if you want a home. We can't house you. And so then it's like, it's about who has the privilege to move, and then maybe staying is also a privilege and people should have a right to stay.
There's also just this unsustainable regional disparity. It's a source of great irritation that the Tories came up with something like levelling up in such a cynical way that didn't produce anything and now makes people kind of, you know, look askance at it. But
I mean, also, if we're being honest, they're the reason that communities have been left behind, that they need to level up. They're the reason there's no coal mining or steel industry in countries like Wales. So they came, impoverished these areas, and then they're like, come on, chaps, we're going to level you up.
And the other thing that I think is kind of more philosophically interesting is this thing of like, well, I can work from anywhere, and, you know, the internet and this and that. And people talk about it, or it is packaged in terms of freedom, but it's like freedom for whom? Freedom for whom and to do what? Because this is one of those kind of zero sum things where, well, one person's freedom to move is another person's inability to stay. You move to the Mumbles, then the people who have lived in the Mumbles for generations can't stay because they can't afford to. And each individual decision is being made in a kind of very individual way on the basis of kind of perfectly, I would say, generally honourable personal decisions that when you put them all together end up squeezing some people out.
Yeah, and I think the thing that was sitting with me, and Rhiannon does it very poignantly by talking about the road that she rents on being blocked by an English woman getting her hot tub installed, and then she sees like a fire pit van go past. So it's like this woman is, you know, living it up in Mumbles with her hot tub and fire pit. Please invite me. It's this place that is so beautiful and so wonderful, and people should be allowed to visit, and people should be allowed to move, but we do blithely make all these individual decisions, and none of us is responsible for gentrification. But I guess I think we do need to be mindful. And I say this as someone who grew up in an area that has gentrified, probably past the point which I could move back to it, Brixton. I, in turn, have contributed to the gentrification of Hackney. I moved to Hackney when I was 21, to Shoreditch. Rents were cheap. I moved further and further out of Hackney to places that then gentrified. And as you say, like at the time, I was just moving wherever I could pay £500 rent and still go out dancing in my favorite establishments in East London. But yeah, I think the thing that I do think matters, and I do think that you can control, is that if you move somewhere, you should have a connection to that place. Like for me, it's like the corner shop test of like, you need to know who your local corner shop person is, and you need to say hi to them. And there are a million other ways that you can invest in a community. But I think that sense of a transient people with money who are like, I can live anywhere. And isn't that fun? I'm a digital nomad. But you don't invest in the community. You don't learn like its history, the different cultures and countries that are there, especially if you're somewhere like London. And then you move on because you're not invested, and you've helped to push up the house prices for someone else. And then you're off to your next adventure because you want a fire pit now.
So I think that this is actually, there's a limit to what you can do as an individual here. And I think this is where government, leadership, regional policies come in. The state does have the capacity, or should have the capacity, to have things like rent controls, things that remove speculation from the equation.
Yeah, the solutions are national, and I think we all have a responsibility. Like everyone has the right to leave where they're born and have a life somewhere else. And for some of us, that's important. You know, if you grow up in a small homophobic town, you have a right to move to London. If you want to move to London or Birmingham or Bristol or Hebden Bridge, like we have the right to move, and people have the right to stay. And yeah, and if you're moving in somewhere, learn the person, like get to know your corner shop person, and yeah, invest in the area that you're in. I think that's a fair thing to ask of people, and build more social housing.
My under is income tax.
Okay, say more.
Well, when I went to university, which it was a long time ago, 87 to 92, I got a full grant. I paid no tuition. And people would sometimes, like Americans and others, they would look in kind of wonder at this kind of, how's that? And I'd say, well, the deal is, I think, when I graduate, if I get a well-paying job, I will pay taxes so that someone else can do that. I'm proud to live in a country that sustained me during periods. I was brought single-parent family. My dad left when I was 1. Free school dinners. My mum was nocturnal epileptic. She got the care she needed. We didn't go bankrupt. I had a hernia when I was 8. I got the care I needed. We didn't go bankrupt. When I got the grades, I went to university. The state did that. That's people's taxes. That's people. I would like to do that for someone else. We have the main parties saying we won't raise income tax. We also know that we have a massive revenue shortfall, that our hospitals don't work, that our rail system doesn't work, that this country is massively underinvested in. We also have the highest tax burden that we've had for some time, but that's because of VAT primarily. I think there will be, maybe someone from the IFS will come on and contradict me, but regressive taxes like VAT and council tax and things like that, we do have a high tax burden. But I'm now earning enough that I would like to be taxed more. It doesn't help me to be a higher earner who lives in a country where, and have to walk over homeless people. There are a bunch of stuff that I need in terms of schools and hospital care and all the rest of it, and that other people need. I'm not rolling in it. And obviously I want this stuff to go to like social care, health service, education. I don't want it to go to kind of nuclear weapons and other kinds of nonsense. But so long as income tax is not on the table, then we're not having a proper conversation about what this country needs. And rich people should be paying more.
I'm with you. I think for me, the standout moment of that was the first debate between Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, where it got really testy and quibbly because Rishi Sunak was like, he's going to put your taxes up by £2,000. And Keir was like, that's made up maths. And it has been about for over a week now. How did you calculate the 2,000? And did the Treasury calculate it? Was it a Tory researcher? And And you're right. There's no one saying we should be paying more tax. Things cost things. Stuff isn't working. Schools are underfunded. Local authorities are underfunded. At some point, we all need to chip in, and rich people need to chip in more. And I would go further and say income tax should be high for rich people. And we also need to find ways to tax wealth. I mean, I think the other thing that I'd be interested in you talking about is one of the trends we are seeing in British social attitudes and actually more broadly generationally, but it's very true in the UK, is that the thing you described, your childhood, your experience of university, is not true for younger generations. And as a result, we are seeing lower levels of trust and faith and investment in like the welfare state from younger generations who are progressive on other issues. But, and this would be a guess, but please write in if you're a younger listener, people who are 20, who are 18, people who didn't have EMA when they were at sixth form, like they're getting less and less and they're being asked to put in more and more. You know, you talk about COVID, young people sacrificed a lot. So what would you say to younger people who don't really buy into tax or welfare? Like, how do we make that pitch to people who haven't had much?
Yeah. And I would say, first of all, I absolutely sympathize with you. You've been stiffed. And this country has consistently and determinedly underfunded its youth and its children, and it's criminal. I want to pay more so they can build houses that you can afford. Join me in that kind of crusade, if you like, that there is this generation of transfer of wealth and of hope from young people to older people. And it's not right. And in the same way that I call on and welcome when white people call out racism, when men call out sexism, when straight people call out homophobia, it's important for people of my age to say, look, your grievance is not misplaced. We have to work towards a kind of strategy and the kind of politics that are going to recalibrate the system that we live in.
Okay, I mean, we've done a lot of slogan T-shirts today, but I feel like yours would say, tax me more.
Tax me.
Tax me, baby. Yeah. Yeah.
See, the baby really, that really makes it work.
That makes it a T-shirt. That's what I'm here for. I'm landing the plane. Yeah. I'm with you. We need to make the case for tax. We need to talk about tax. Tax is a good thing. When it works, it's pretty magical.
And even if in the political atmosphere, there is a disagreement, at least let's have a conversation about it.
I think it's an underestimation of voters, be they vibes and values voters or anything, of like, people know stuff costs stuff, right? Like, we all know we can't get a GP appointment. And it just doesn't pass the sniff test for me that Rishi Sunak's like, I'm going to cut your taxes so that I can get a GP appointment in a month. Like stuff costs money. Why don't we pay for stuff with taxes and money?
And, there's stuff. We need a train system that works. And if we don't, then when we get what we get in motorways that are clogged and worse air, and the country doesn't work. Something that happened to me, this would have been about 3 or 4 months ago. I was coming back from Coventry to London. Should have taken about an hour and a quarter, an hour and a half, something like that. And that train went as far as Rugby. Then we got taken off that train and we were told to get onto a replacement bus that would take us to Milton Keynes. And then we would get on the train.
Replacement bus, that's bad vibes. Always bad vibes.
You have no idea. We get on the replacement bus. The replacement bus breaks down on the motorway and we have to get out of the replacement bus and wait for a replacement bus to replace the replacement bus. We're all standing by the motorway.
So wait, you stood on the motorway?
Just standing by the side of the motorway in the rain, waiting for a replacement bus to pick us up because our replacement bus has broken down. We then get a replacement bus to Milton Keynes. And then we get on a train, which is delayed by about another 45 minutes because there are swans on the line. Swans. The king's bird. You can't fuck with the swans.
That is the most British shit in the world. Don't mess with the swans, Gary. Don't bother the swans.
You can fly human beings to Rwanda, but don't fuck with the swans. So then we get to Euston and it's completely chaotic. And what was interesting for me was that when I told people that story, even though every step of the way, it wasn't the government's fault about the replacement bus, it wasn't the government's fault about the swans, but everybody understood that as a metaphor for what is going on in this country. That was the only way that people understood it. They didn't understand it as like, that was bad luck. That was a series of unlucky things. It was like, this country is in the crapper. And it speaks to a general experience of like, things don't work. Things just don't work. And the reason they don't work is because we haven't invested in them.
Yeah. Good under the radar. Tax me, baby.
Tax me, baby.
Tax him. He wants to be taxed.
You have been listening to Over the Top and Under the Radar.
Remember to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Make sure you sign up to our newsletter at overunderpod.com.
And from this week, we're launching our Patreon and there'll be a weekly bonus episode that you can get there if you support us. Search for Over the Top, Under the Radar on Patreon.